Hello. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Everyone a chance to connect here. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Jillian LeClaire, your Director of Alumni Engagement here at Florida Tech. And I want to thank you all for joining us today for a very special Lunch and Learn lecture. I'm so excited to partner with Florida Tech School of Arts and Communication adjunct faculty member Don Harrell to provide this lecture for you on the history and evolution of African American music culture. The lecture will be about 45 minutes with 15 minutes reserved at the end for questions and discussion. But if you think of any questions during the presentation, you want to enter them in the chat, feel free to do so whenever, and then Professor Harrell will get to them at the end. Lastly, and I'm sure you've heard this in every Zoom event that you've been to, but please leave your microphone on mute throughout the duration of the event to prevent any audio feedback and keep it clear for everybody. So really quickly, to get a better idea of who's joining us today, please go to the chat box and type in your name, your class year, and what location you're joining us from. And yes, Mike, the program is being recorded and I'll send everyone a link afterwards. So you have Mike from Seattle, Jane Allen, who has a side D, nice to see you. Michelle from Maryland. Bob Fechner, class of 1986 from St. Pete, Florida, welcome. Betty Lou, board member with WeVenture, thank you for joining us. Hi, Wilbur. Wendy, not an alum, but a former student of Dr. Harrell, so we know he must be great if she's attending.
Yes.
Hi, Alan. Well, thank you all so much. And let me just quickly introduce our esteemed faculty lecturer. So Don Harrell is an African studies scholar, ethnomusicologist, folklorist, and musician who has been teaching in the classroom for 20 years. He is currently an adjunct faculty member at Florida Tech, teaching the inaugural Modern African American Studies class, as well as the Evolution of Hip Hop class in the Developing African American Studies minor. He is co-founder of a performing arts and education company, Orishi Rishi, I think I'm saying that right? Orishi Rishi,
yes, perfect.
African folklore, serving to reacquaint African Americans with their African culture and enrich their sense of pride in their cultural roots. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Harrell.
Great, thank you, Lynn. Jillian, I am just overflowing with positive emotion here. I'm so glad that you invited me and gave me an opportunity to share information and knowledge that's very key to my existence. I've been on the same journey for a long time. The music of Africa and African American music as it presents itself in America has been very, very key to my evolution as an individual. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey, and I'm going to use a PowerPoint and jot down your questions, and we will address them as we move forward. So without further ado, I'll go to the PowerPoint and we'll get at it, okay? Okay. The history and evolution of African American music culture, a lesson in resilience. I'm going to start out with a bit of creativity. This is a story, a child-centered story that kind of puts the rhythmic nature and the importance of music in the lives of Africans in perspective. And I'll interlace it with some content and get back to it. And it's called the Earth's Heartbeat. Long before time, before hours, minutes, and seconds on the continent of Africa, the Earth's heart beat for the first people. The beat filled the air with spirits, which rose on the wind and flew into their bodies, and their hearts beat for the first time. They were alive. The beat moved through their bodies and pushed out through their hands. That is how their drum was born. The drum spoke to the animals and to the people. The earth's heart beat out the rhythm of all there is. They listened and sounded it back for her to hear. Then men from another continent came, men who would not listen to the rhythm of the earth. They shackled them and flung them into the belly of ships, bringing them enslaved across oceans and seas. They tore them apart from one another and would not allow them to speak their own languages. They were a lost people. They were no longer free. They thought they were no more. Then they took the drums away. But cruelty did not stop the earth's heart from beating. It spoke to them still, and its rhythm pushed not only out of their hands, but out of their entire bodies. And they became the drums, living drums, beating for the whole world to see and hear. So when they walked along the path or worked in the fields, they made their feet drums. When they spoke to one another or sang their blues, spiritual, gospel, jazz, rhythm and blues, soul, funk, and hip hop songs in the moonlit skies, they made their voices drums. They were the earth's people, the living drums, beating for the whole world to see and hear, and they would always be free. What were the global forces that foreshadowed the evolution of music in the American tradition in the Americas? The papal bull, Ater Regis. The papal bull Ater Regis, issued on June 2nd, 1481, by Pope Sixtus IV, confirmed the granting of all further rights to acquisitions made by Christian powers in Africa and eastward to the Indies to Portugal. The papal bull Inter Cetera, which was issued by Pope Alexander VI on the 4th of May, 1493, authorizing Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas and to subjugate the people found there to their will. The Protestant Reformation caused tension in Europe and ignited a spirit of competition among the European nations, which was fueled by religious fervor that spread from the European continent throughout the Atlantic world. This tension manifested in Africa and the Americas as Europeans squabbled over land for colonies extraditing resources, converting the indigenous populations to their respective versions of Christianity, securing trading posts, and reaping profits from the extremely lucrative slave trade. Message to the youth of America. Thousands and thousands of years from the time of their birth until they pass on to the hereafter, the lives of the people of Africa is filled with music making that is meant to make the desirable happen, music that is steeped in the rhythm of the earth and the earth's heartbeat. Over the course of the last 500 years, nearly 15 million Africans were transported against their will to the Caribbean and North, South, and Central America. Upon arrival, they were faced with untold hardships as they were made to provide free labor on plantations practically every waking moment of the rest of their lives. Their children and their children's children for many generations would suffer the same or similar fates. And in order to survive, so that their descendants could be here today, they called upon music, as did those before them. So new music was created, like salsa, calypso, rumba, samba, reggae, reggaeton, spirituals, blues, jazz, gospel, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, and hip hop. And the one thing that they have in common is that they are all steeped in the rhythm of the earth and the earth's heartbeat. African American music is an umbrella term covering a diverse range of music and music genres that were largely developed by African Americans. Their origins are in musical forms that arose out of historical conditions of slavery that characterized the lives of African Americans prior to the American Civil War. White enslavers sought to completely subjugate the enslaved physically, mentally, and spiritually through brutality and dehumanization. White Americans considered African Americans separate and unequal and went to extraordinary lengths to keep them oppressed for centuries. African Americans, in response, created music that countered both this narrative, the efforts of it on their daily lives, and the marginalization that it callously fostered. This is an example of an early field holler or call, precursor to the early blues. Thought I'd share it. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let's see if we can get there without any real problem.
Well, if I had followed, boys, my old second mind, I'd say I'd have been up the country my old second time.
Yes,
Woo.
yes.
Boy, I'm feeling low down today.
I know you, son. Go sing them old Little Count Blues. I know you got them.
Oh, Mr. Charlie, Mr. Ludlow Joe. I'd undecided, oh boy, I won't work no more.
Oh, look at here. Oh, I'm going to get Little Count Bodosha. Lord, for to hold my head.
Flip your own, boy.
I'm gonna get bulldozer women for to make up my bed.
Hey, get up there, will you?
Well, look at here, boy. That old mule ain't gonna get back. You ain't gonna drive no more.
I see.
Well, look at here. You got to
Hey, I don't want this old levee, boy, till my feet got numb. Boy, if you see Miss Charlie, ask him, did his money come?
Oh, boy. Oh, my hamstring is popping. Boy, did my collar cry. Ain't nothing breaking, boys, but the long sideline.
Yeah, hey, get over there, Charlie.
Boy, look here. I tell you one thing, we got to build that levee way up yonder.
Man,
Soul house, you don't fit in your guitar working on this levee, but I'm gonna try it out.
well, you know, ain't nothing for us no harm but living in the killing.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, come on in now. Dive on in now, you know, son, because I'm gonna spot him. Come on down.
I looked at the captain, boy, and I walked away.
Ah, boy.
I asked the straw boss man, what's the time of day?
Oh, boy. Look at here. I tell you about it. I'm going on down the river. Oh, Lord. Get over there. How you gonna do that, man? Look at here. I tell you one thing, that old pull it old mule. Oh, boy, for to pack some slack. Oh, baby, I'm gonna bring you some money when I come back.
Oh, yeah, don't you?
Just spit and Joe, you know, boy, I'm about to do what I said. Yeah?
I heard you when you first drove up.
Yeah. Come on, you know, son, we got to go. I see about Willie Brown, yes, sir.
Okay.
Following the Civil War,
Oh, baby.
I gotta get rid of that. Hold on,
What you want me to do?
gotta
But to give you my
Okay,
money
yeah,
and die for you. Well, I was waiting.
You guys enjoy that while I
for my summer
something
change. I was waiting on my summer change. And just as soon as the wind rise again, I'm gonna go away. I take my 3220 and lay you in your grave. And the day resurrection, you're gonna rise again. One of these old days, I hope it don't be long. I'm gone.
I think I got success. There you go. From ragtime to jazz, following the Civil War, through employment as musicians playing European music in military bands, developed a new style of music called ragtime, which gradually evolved into jazz. One of the most notable ragtime musicians was James Reese, who led the 369th Harlem Hellfighters, a group of National Guardsmen who fought valiantly in France during World War I. During the course of their time in France, they had an opportunity to participate in a military style competition. Mr. Reese, or James Reese, was already kind of, beginning to fool around with this ragging up tunes. They didn't call it jazz or anything, but it was ragtime. And he had the band to perform a ragged up military march. The people in France went berserk. And they began to kind of come up with words to try to describe what they had experienced. And within their fooling around with ways to try to verbally articulate what they just experienced, the word jazz evolved. Now, these genres of music had a wide-ranging influence on the development of music in general within the United States and around the world during the 20th century. Many of you already are aware of the Roaring Twenties and how the jazz age began to evolve in urban centers around the country. It provided a opportunity and motivation for people of different ethnicities to begin to at least get to know each other and live outside of that separate but equal world that haunts us even now. There's a picture of James Reese and the 368th Harlem Hellfighters. After World War I, when they came back to Harlem, hey, it was the biggest party you could imagine. The war was over, and the colored soldiers had acquitted themselves quite well. One of the problems with that, though, however, which is an aside from talking about music, was there was a new sense of self-worth that evolved, and a new phrase came with it called the new Negro, and also a new determination to do things like participate in the body politic and actually vote. The pushback was swift and it was severe, and it would characterize the rest of the 20th century, in my view. The earliest jazz and blues recordings were made in the 1920s. African Americans developed related styles such as rhythm and blues in the 1940s. And in the 1960s, soul music performers had a major influence on white United Kingdom and US singers. In the mid-1960s, Black musicians developed funk. And they were some of the leading figures in the late 1960s and 1970s genres of jazz rock fusion. In the 1970s and 1980s, Black artists developed a music that is still resonating and has dwarfed many of the genres that preceded it in terms of its ability to reap financial reward. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that started very meagerly. It's been through a lot of different phases, and it's called hip hop. We'll talk more about it as we move forward, because I'm teaching a section called the Evolution of Hip Hop right now at Florida Tech, and my students wanted to chime in. They got their say, so we're gonna get to their say in a moment. Contextuality. The entirety of the African American existence in the New World is in the context of the struggle for emancipation from slavery and the struggle for civil rights. The single most potent means of realizing these goals is the music that they created and the culture milieu that surrounds it. My mentor, J.H. Kwabena Nkatia, the noted African ethnomusicologist, in his book, The Music of Africa, describes the music of Africa as a network of distinct yet related traditions which overlap in certain aspects of style, practice, or usage, and share common features of internal patterns, basic procedure, and contextual similarities. I postulate that that same dynamic came with Africans to these shores, and that it is part and parcel of this music that we call African American music culture. I'll explain what I mean here. The foundational elements of African music and African American music are cries, calls and hollers, call and response devices, additive and polyrhythms, heterophony, pendular thirds, blue notes, bent notes and elisions, hums, moans, and grunts, vocables and other oral declarations, interjections and punctuations, offbeat melodic phrasings and parallel intervals and chords, constant repetition of rhythmic and melodic features and phrases from which vamps could be derived, game rivalry, hand clapping, foot patting, and approximations thereof, the part playing, and the metronomic sense that underlies all of the music of Africa. With this in mind, I'd like to point out that all of the genres of music are pretty much the same as in terms of those types of qualities and elements of music. So all of the genres created by African Americans are pretty much the same. I have a hard time explaining that to my students in the evolution of hip hop, but usually by the end of the term, they really understand that, hey, look, there's nothing new under the sun. Each generation feels like their music is, all that, and that, they've created something out of nothing. And lo and behold, the elders had done it long before. It's kind of like redevelopment or an evolution of the very same kind of thing. Because the context hasn't changed, the struggle continues, and so does the music to counter it. One of the things about music in Africa and in the African American milieu is that music is a practical matter. It's not for beauty's sake, it's to make the desirable happen. That's why when we look at it too closely, elements of it, you can't really understand why it's important to the people who are making that music unless you understand what it is that they see as a need that's being met via that music. So if you don't mind, I'll share this poll that I did with my students in Evolution of Hip Hop, because the hypothesis is that the music of Africa in the America has constantly been tugging at the strings of racism and the thing that undergirds it, white supremacy, from the beginning even until now. One of the things that stands out to me when you talk about this latest genre of African-American music, hip hop, is that several noted scholars have said that if there were not for this hip hop generation, as they are called, there never would have ever been anyone called Barack Obama serving as president of the United States. Go back in time and see how that whole thing happened. Nor would you see the kinds of things we've seen over the summer as a reaction to some of the police brutality that the recent unrest addressed. Here's what my students say now to this question. Has hip hop played a positive role in uprooting racism in the past? 79.2% of them said yes. 15.6% of them said no. And there were 5.2% of the students who take evolution of hip hop who said that they were uncertain. I posed one other question, or two others. The second question is hip hop playing a positive role in uprooting racism now? 81.9% of my current students said yes, affirmative. 12.5% of them said no. And another 5.6% of them were uncertain. And the final question, with regard to not only hip hop, but African music, African American music as we know it, as an affront to the 800-pound gorilla in the house, It's been with us from the onset of the Republic, and it's reared its ugly head even here in the 21st century. Will hip hop play a positive role in uprooting racism in the future? Young people, 17, 18, 19-year-old college students say yes by 84.7%. The no's were only 9.7%, and the uncertain were 5.6%. The uncertains are the students I got to focus on for the rest of the term. As you see, I'm passionate about this thing. We kind of told you, and I'm not, pulling any punches. This is how I see it. I see it all connected. It's all one. African-American music is all one, and it's a part of everything that Africans in the Americas have done has been in the context of a struggle for survival, civil rights, and for equality under the law. I yield my time. Questions, please. If not, I'll play some music for you. Y'all want to hear some more blues? Let's see.
Does anybody have any questions? Don, do you want me to stop sharing your screen?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And Betty Lou asked if you could share the link to that website that you played that one song from.
Yes. Yes. You don't want me to start? Is it okay? I'm not sharing my screen now. Y'all want me to start doing my senior shuffle on this computer right now or not?
We can't see it, so.
You can't see what I'm doing? Okay, I can share then. Let me find it. Oh, there it is. Okay.
Okay, and you should all be able to unmute to ask your question. I just turned that setting on, so feel free.
I have a question, Roger in Manassas.
Yes.
Your poll seems to just take concern with your present students. I don't think if you took a poll with the same questions, you would probably find the same answers and percentages, because I think racism and white supremacy is so deep in the older people in this country, and I'm one of them, being 74 years old at this point. I don't think you'd find the same percentages, and that's what scares me about racism in the United States. You're talking about two or three maybe at least two generations back, where the percentages are probably much different. And I also I understand, and I believe, I agree with you that the African music has demonstrated the struggle with African Americans, and I just don't think that. I think if you got a larger poll with other people, you would probably find your percentages much different.
Absolutely, no question. The reason I thought that the poll was so telling is because it's always been the youth. It's been the youth. The youth are the ones who not only develop the music, but all the changes in society come from the youth. These answers were not prompted. However, they were students in my class, but they are representative of today's, I forget what they call them, generation, whatever college students are called now. They call them Z's or something. They're running out of letters here. But yes, my experiences and yours, were quite different. Because of my activism, I had to learn to be colorblind. And, it's been it was a process over time. I also had to learn to not look at people who were unlike me in any way as the other. We have to make a concerted effort to do that kind of thing, and be willing to, self-correct when you find out. I mean, I characterize racism as an 800-pound gorilla, but there's other gorillas amidst. There's sexism abound. There's all kinds of ways that people look down on one another because of individual differences. There's xenophobia. There's a lot of kinds of things. Now, I'm just pointing to the fact that in the latter part of the 20th century and this first part of the 21st century, which is a time that many say is characterized by a music called rap and hip hop and the cultures that surround it. Because of the way it entered society and because of new technologies, it's been able to accomplish things that blues singer way back, working back down south that we heard earlier could not do. Here's the thing that I'm struggling with. The global impact of our exporting of music culture. There's a global imprint of hip hop, and it represents a global imprint of a Black cultural form that is being used by people around the world to address oppression. Things like a regime of a president that wants to run for office for 3 times when the limit is 2 times in Senegal not long ago. The young people who happen to be hip hop artists beg to differ. And they launched a movement verbally with rhythm based on what they had seen done in the Americas among Black Americans and actually won. That same thing occurred in other parts of the world. In the Middle East, the summer, the hot summer, it was in the Middle East when there was so much unrest and all of this activism against oppressive conditions by leaders who would not leave office was created by hip hop artists who developed their art form based on the model that started under oppressive conditions of the South Bronx back in 1972. Go figure. What's important about the South Bronx in 1972? That was, if you can recall historically, that was just about the time when the compassionate conservatism began to push back against the war on poverty, the passing of the Voting Rights Bill, and so on and so forth. And these kids were kind of left holding the bag with nothing but misery. Their reaction, create a music to tell their story and to try and do something about their condition. And here it is, 40-something years later, multi-billion-dollar industry that's affecting change all over the world, has gone beyond ethnicity. It's going beyond religion. It's going beyond, sexual preferences. There's a feminist critique. It's a part of it to male chauvinism. And so that's it. The music has just gone, and this technology, it's the same thing, but now a kid could sit here in this room and collaborate with someone in Israel today, or in Africa. And that's the difference. Next question. I'm sorry, I'm a soapbox guy. You put me on my soapbox, I just go for it.
I see 3 raised hands.
Yes.
Obina.
Yes.
Alumni.
Yes. Hi.
Alumni.
Hi.
That's that right there. That right there, right there. That boy right there. If I'm not mistaken, he's evil.
That's right.
And I want you to know, if you want to, don't get it twisted. If you look at any ethnic group, any in this country, and you look at how much they've accomplished academically, you'd find out that the Igbos have more PhDs and doctors and lawyers and Indian chiefs than any other single group. Right or wrong, Obina?
No, that's right. That's actually right. But yeah. Anyway, I'm a student at FIT currently. I graduated with my master's a couple years ago, and now I proceeded to do my graduate. So that's kind of in line with what you're saying. However, I have a question about the topic today. What would you say the impact of the, I guess, commercialization of music now in a way that it has never been has affected the message and the original intent of African American music per se? So as you went historically, right, you highlighted, and I think correctly, that it was a way of expressing a way of expressing the situation of the people, right? But then now I think, and I say this as a young man, right? While there are some artists who still embody that struggle, a lot of it, I think, has been co-opted by this desire to, get rich quick, which is good, but we have to acknowledge that it takes away from the original intent of music as a way of express, struggle and circumstances around the people. So what do you have to say about that per se?
Well, from the onset, it's all that and everything else. There are those artists whose whole thing is about fame and wealth, and they have no compunction to, they'll do whatever it takes. The message will be whatever it is that sells. But at the same time, if you really got a chance to kind of look at the culture, as I've done over many years, I started as an ethnomusicologist my whole thing was African rhythms and rhythm modalities in the Americas. But then I found out that, hey, I don't have to really go where people are playing drums and doing, ethnic things, that the rhythms that I was talking about were happening in more profusity in hip hop. Mm. So I began to take a close look, and I found out that what you see in the commercialization, which again, there's nothing wrong with making money, particularly if you're from a group of people who never had none. Mm-hmm. And concerted efforts have been made over 400 years to keep you from getting some. Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with that. But the real strength of hip hop is beneath the commercialization. That's the part that you don't really see because it's not on TV. It's not on, it's not on the radio. This is a movement where people are speaking to one another and making real sense. And the struggle for survival, liberation, and equal justice of the law has been intensified because of that undergirding power of Black music in the Americas.
I
as seen through hip hop. Mm-hmm.
I agree. Yeah, I'm a huge Kendrick Lamar fan, so he's he keeps it real and he still makes money. That's why.
Yeah. Well, he's a part of he's his album To Pimp a Butterfly was was a collaboration with this underground hip hop movement in LA called Project Blowed. And these guys never compromise. In fact, the whole underground movement was a reaction to gangster rap. They beg the difference. No, we're not sagging our pants. We're not using 4-letter words every second, and we're not lying about our wealth and our sexual prowess. We're dealing with the problems that our people are confronting.
Exactly.
And that's the kind of world that he built that album And so, yes.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to highlight, I guess. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Another question, please.
Bob, did you have a question?
I did. And I actually read it in the chat as well. And it's on sideline. I'm a musician too. I've actually played trumpet and I've played in some blues bands and things like that, and really enjoy it. And I like the point you made about or it might have been Obina made about the fact that music, pure music, comes from inside, and it's not necessarily the generation of money or wealth. But I like that your point as that. It's a great opportunity, though, if you can make that. But my question was, what is the role of different cities that played in the different played in the development of the different genres within African American music? Because I know you think of New Orleans and you think of Memphis and Nashville, and you mentioned L.A. and you mentioned New York, and so just speak to that a little bit, please.
Well, think of it like this: you got all of these African people from all these different ethnic groups, and they hear together starting in the 1600s, and great effort is being made to make sure that they know only what the enslaver wants them to know. So they're separated according to language and culture. But there were certain things that are a part of African culture and have been so for thousands and thousands of years that they shared in common. One of which was the ring shout. And the ring shout is how they built new communities. The most prominent and most well-known ring shout was in Congo Square of New Orleans. Of course, the French had a different approach to how they handled the enslaved, and this allowed for more freedom. Like they could meet on once a week and go to Congo Square, and though you didn't speak different languages, you could commune and begin to build community and understand each other through ritual kind of performance, which was pretty much a ring shout. And they understood that they knew the same kind of the music. They couldn't speak, but they could make music together. That was the beginning of a building of community. Now take Congo Square and multiplied by several thousand times all over the place, and you got a community developing. And then it's under certain kinds of conditions, and the conditions were work, a way to sometimes recreation, but a way to communicate or let your frustrations go. And, so that helped with the blues. There was this need to identify with something larger than yourself. And that was how the spirituals developed. But the truth of it all is the blues, which kind of was like everywhere. Out of that, by the time the hymns and the psalms began to be presented to the enslaved, because prior to that, you couldn't read, stay away from the Bible, stay away from everything. But after the Protestant Reformation, when hymns and psalms were presented to Africans, they began and Bible stories, they used that to develop something other than the work songs and this blues-like stuff. And it was called the Negro spirituals. And then, so every time there was an opportunity, something else would develop. What really one of the things that really put this whole thing into motion was World War I and the military bands, and actually looking for who, they didn't really care who can play the trumpet, so, hey, man, my great-great-grandfather played something like that. And out of that began to develop this new music that we know, that we call jazz. First it was ragtime and jazz, and by the time the plantation life goes upstream to the cities, you get to rhythm and blues. But it didn't just go to Harlem and places like that. The blues came up the Delta, all the way from Mississippi, all up to St. Louis, and keep on going and stuff. And all that stuff came back to us with the boys from Great Britain, the Rolling Stone and what was it, the Beatles and such. Everything comes full circle, but it all started down there on those plantations, man, under the most dire circumstances, when people were just using music to survive and struggle, advocate for their rights. That's it. It continues today. That's what it is. That's all it is. And, you know, we can thank, so, you know, and, you know, I'm not tooting my whistle, tooting my horn or whistle. What I'm saying, because at the same time, there's syncretism. You know, people borrow stuff. Africans didn't have no, the African Americans didn't have those trumpets and stuff that they learned to play. You know, they developed the banjo and the, you know, because it was so close to the instruments they had known before. But they took those things and Africanized them, just like they do gumbo soup, you know? So that's the way we roll, baby, you know? Yeah.
Very good.
So, man, I really appreciate your question.
Yeah,
I'm sure I didn't answer it, but did I made a stab at it, man.
You did, because it's obviously it permeates over different areas, and you know, I think it is interesting because you do hear, you know, when I think of jazz, I think of New Orleans, you know, I think of the blues, I think of Memphis, and so, you know, it just kind of comes into play. So you think of certain cities. When I think of rap, I think of LA. So you know, and so I just thought it was interesting that, you know, different cities kind of had, you know, the genres kind of what's the word I'm looking for? I think they kind of were predominant in different cities, but I like that insight of, you know, it really moved up the Delta, and it kind of expanded out from the plantation.
Absolutely.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And look, LA had no hip hop for at least a decade or so. I mean, it started like in South Bronx and in Harlem. And then, you know, it started, you know, in nooks and crannies. I mean, I'm talking about a one-horse town. You had people rapping. And eventually, this kind of music and stuff found its way all across the country. And again, we think of LA because it's a music center. And when they came out with that gangster rap, it hit so hard, you know? It was like, it's like unforgettable stuff, you know? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome. Thank you for your question. Anyone else?
Looks like Bino has his hand up.
Yes.
Oh, you're muted. Hold on one second.
You got to unmute Mr. Capapino.
Sorry about that. First of all, thank you for giving a shout out to the English. You know, we appreciate it. That's great.
Well, hey, look, man, I'm not going to cut across your question, but if not for you and stuff, I mean, you know what I mean? You know what you did.
Yeah, of course.
But you played homage to the real blues stuff. When people here didn't even respect it anymore, you brought it back to them and said, hey, look, you got something great here. It was a voice from Britain who brought it here and made us respect something that came up organically from out of our plantation 200 years before.
So I think that the point I was going to make, I think it's interesting, you kind of touched it a little bit, is the difference, I think, today. So my parents, you know, in England, Rolling Stones, the Beatles introduced them to that type of music a little bit. Generation X, my generation, we kind of got into it through Aerosmith combined with, you know, Run DMC, maybe the Beastie Boys brought us into opening our eyes to maybe Public Enemy and some other, you know, some NWA. But today, my children, there's no filter. It's directly from the hip hop generation. They're getting it directly. No, they don't need no white band to join in. They're getting unfiltered. And so I think there's a big difference in that. The fact is they're directly connected and they're learning that generation. So they don't feel apart as much as maybe my generation or my parents' generation. And I think you see that when you look at the protests this summer. The crowds were definitely a lot of young white college kids, high school kids, and they didn't feel like they shouldn't be there. Like,
no. And they were not.
They felt part of it. Whereas when I'm there, I'm maybe feeling, I wonder if I should be it, you know, kind of thing. That's the difference, I think, and that's why your poll, I think, is the way it is. They really do see it as in a different way than my generation and the gentleman who asked the first question, his generation. And that's the hope for the future, I think. You know, even though we're going through some tough times now, the hope is with the young generation, I think.
We do have a lot of hope because of what the dynamic you just pointed to. Yes, you know, the young people now are different. it was, I mean, as late as the 50s in this country, we still, everything was segregated, even listening. Rhythm and blues, or they used to call it race music in the late 40s. And there was no stations black-owned stations playing their race music. And then after World War II, a few AM signals popped up. And the thing about AM signals in the US is that though they're weak signals, because of the contours of the earth, they could bounce off of mountains and be heard 1,000 miles away. And so young white kids begin to listen to that race music. Eventually somebody, as always, decided, whoa, buddy, here's a way to make some money. So you take this race music, you change the name of it from rhythm and blues or race music or whatever you want to call it, and call it rock and roll. You cover it, get some white folks to cover it, and bingo, we all go to the bank. And that's exactly what occurred. So you flash forward to hip hop trying to make its way out of Harlem and South Bronx. It was the punk rock kids downtown who took to it. They were rebels, and they already had begun to feel the music. You see, that's what occurs. And that's how it is in the case of your kids. It's that they grew up as a part of this. They're not separate from it. The music speaks to them aesthetically. And it's been a gradual thing over time. If you separate it from it, it doesn't happen. But over the last 70 years, folks, more and more people, you listen to country music now. You hear all these African elements and stuff. And, it's only people like me who will point it out, not because I'm trying to claim it, but I'm just saying we're all one. We're all one because you have become what I am, and I have become what you are. That's where we are.
Yeah, I think so. And I think just last point to Albino, when he mentioned, I think the fact that you got such a now big swath of hip hop music, and it's not just, this focus, that's the growth and the development. I mean, we don't have 2000 Bob Dylans. You have Bob Dylan, BG, you have all this type of music. And I think that's what hip hop's done. It's expanded beyond its horizons. And that's why it's having such an influence around the world. No one wants to listen to the same, message over and over, hammered down their phone. It's become a whole genre instead of this narrow genre, maybe at the beginning. And I think that's made the difference and why it's so pervasive in our society.
I'm completely amazed every day. My mentor, who was J.H. Kwabena Gatia of Ghana, where I studied for a while at the University of Ghana. And, but I met his son, his wife, and today his grandson is one of the biggest rappers, stars, or artists in Africa. So I'm saying, whoa. And this, this all happened within a relatively short period of time. When his father his grandfather was critiquing the music of Africa for the first time and making it accessible to academics around the world. And now here's a young man who's taking the African-American music nuance, configuring it based on Ghanaian sensibilities and presenting it to Africa. It's an amazing world right now we have, Yeah.
All right, well, I think that's all we have for time. And I don't see any other questions in the chat, but I wanted to say thank you again, Professor Harrell, for talking to us today. And I really loved what you read at the beginning about the beat of the earth and the heartbeat and the beat of the music. And just listening to our discussion, it's true that music has the ability to connect us all because we're all the same in here. So thank you so much for sharing that for us.
I feel like dropping a beat. We can all dance right on out of here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you guys for attending. Everyone have a wonderful and safe day. Take care. Bye-bye.